Over NBC's coast-to-coast network of independent affiliated stations, the University of Chicago Round Table. Be sure to listen for a special announcement at the close of today's program explaining how you can participate in NBC's University of the Air by joining Round Table home study courses. To open today's discussion of Democracy, World Hope, we present Richard P. McKeon, member of the American delegation to UNESCO and of the Department of Greek and Philosophy of the University of Chicago. Mr. McKeon.
During the past week, we've heard the exciting news of the end of the Berlin blockade. There have been pictures that have appeared in the press in which the roadblocks were removed from the road to Berlin, weeds at the side of the road were being carefully cleaned away, and the locomotive, which had spent the period of the blockade in Berlin, was oiled and repaired. Now the discussion of the problem of Germany and of the world is to be resumed. It's a problem that turns on the question of democracy. Are the mental roadblocks down also? Meeting with me this morning around the microphone are Louis Wirth, sociologist, Herman Feiner, political scientist, colleagues of mine at the University of Chicago, who will discuss the problem of understanding and differences about democracy. Wirth, are the mental blockades?
The physical blockades, as you have described them, are certainly down. The crack in the door is open. Discussion can begin. But we must recognize that a discussion will take place against a background of misunderstanding and suspicion. We still believe there is a fundamental difference between peace-loving and warlike peoples, liberty-loving versus non-liberty-loving peoples, democratic versus autocratic peoples. And there are many people in America who think that America has a monopoly on democracy. And the reports they get from Russia confirm them in their conviction. At the same time, the Russians and their allies claim that they are the only people's democracy. It's against such a background of misunderstanding and ambiguity that the discussions must take place.
Yes, the crack in the door is open, but what's inside the house? I'm still very anxious, I must confess, about the future of peace and justice in the world. There is a momentary agreement on a specific quarrel, and that's to the good. But I have doubts how far this brings our interests and minds into agreement or friendship. Let us recall the phrase in UNESCO's constitution, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be built." Now, my anxiety is, have the minds of men been brought together on their basic differences, namely the meaning of democracy?
McKeon, you've just come back from Paris from a conference that was discussing this question. Would you tell us about that?
That conference might be considered a conference which examined the question of whether the mental roadblocks were down. It was a meeting of experts. It was called by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, because a year ago, UNESCO set up a program to examine the philosophical analysis of ideological conflicts about democracy. In other words, an attempt to find out why the word is ambiguous, why it's used in so many meanings.
But did all of these philosophers and scientists and scholars agree on anything?
They agreed on something, but I think it would be well to consider what their problem was. We met, it was only 8 days ago. I've just returned from Paris. 7 men from seven different nations of the world, and we had before us a group of answers to a long questionnaire. This questionnaire, all about democracy, was sent to the scholars, the experts, the men of affairs of the 48 nations that are part of UNESCO. And we took the 85 answers. They ranged all the way from the extreme left to the extreme right, and on the basis of that, made a report. This report, which I brought with me, seems to me to be of sufficient importance to merit discussion at this crucial time in world history. In fact, the title of this broadcast is borrowed from the report, Democracy, World Hope.
Could I ask a question? Of the 7 people who got together, were any from the countries beyond the so-called Iron Curtain?
None of the committee of experts came from beyond the Iron Curtain, but many of the answers to the questionnaire contained the opinion of the people beyond the Iron Curtain.
Anything from the Soviet?
Not from the Soviet Union, but from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary.
So you really have a world survey of what intelligent people think about democracy.
It's a world survey, and it covers all ranges and degrees of opinion.
You academic people think about democracy.
It's rather more than academic people, since in many of the nations of the world, the academic people have managed to get into the government,
Yes.
and some of them answered as government officials.
Well, McKeon, I'd be very much interested to know whether there was anything at all that they agreed upon.
One very striking point, I think, underlies all of the agreements, and it's a point which impressed me a great deal. In fact, the entire committee was impressed by it. Namely, that not one of the 85 answers to this questionnaire professed to be anti-democratic.
Well, that's really remarkable, considering that in the interwar years, you heard the phrases screamed out, "We spit on liberty," that's Hitler's, and democracy is a decadent and putrid corpse that should have been swept away with the 19th century, from Mussolini.
Yes, the transition is a very important one, and I think it indicates a broad agreement, at least in what you can say. And that is significant because it indicates the ideal at least, that the people participate in their own government and that the interests of the people determine what is good in the government.
But doesn't it mean possibly also that the word democracy has become respectable and hallowed by having been established through World War II? Or does it mean anything more than that people are against sin?
I think it means a lot more. Some of it is very hard to define. It means an agreement about liberty, equality. It means an attempt to get the people to participate in the government, to have the facilities to develop their own faculties, and finally to benefit by the advances of civilization. But more striking than any of these, and they may seem general points, is the fact that all of the answers insisted upon the equality of man, no discrimination against groups, races, or sects.
That certainly represents a contrast to Hitler's doctrine.
Yes, it represents a contrast to a great deal in the 20s. And equally striking is a revulsion against the doctrine that the state is superior to the individual, which is again a revulsion against the 20th century.
Yes, your only question would be there, I suppose we will be taking it up, is in what forms the individual is guaranteed against submersion in the state?
The answers differed a good deal on that point, but I think that before we go into any question of the differences of answers, it is well to bear in mind the frequency with which the Soviet Union and the allies of the Soviet Union have insisted upon their right to the term democracy. That was brought out in a number of statements which were made early in the war. For example, at Tehran in 1943 and again at Yalta in 1945, the three powers announced that they were meeting with an intention to further the political and economic problems of liberated Europe in accordance with democratic principles. And that probably goes back to the earlier statement that Stalin made in his famous broadcast of the 3rd of July, 1941, in which he spoke of the war as being merged with the struggle of the peoples of Europe and America for independence and democratic liberty.
But there is a statement of Stalin's even before 1941, namely his comparison in the speech on the draft of the Russian Constitution made in 1936, in which he said, and I am quoting now, "They talk of democracy. But what is democracy? Democracy in capitalist countries, where there are antagonistic classes, is, in the last analysis, democracy for the strong, democracy for the propertied minority. In the USSR, on the contrary, democracy is democracy for the working people. That is, democracy for all. That surely means that we're using the same term, but don't have the same meaning attached to it."
Yes, well, the use of the word democracy since 1848 is a rather interesting one. Marx started by using democracy as meaning the rulership by the working class. Then a couple of years later, he used it as a stigma. Democracy meant those who were against the working class, that is, the petty bourgeoisie. And against this idea of petty bourgeois democracy, he set proletarian democracy. Now, right down to 1917, the Marxists went back to democracy without any qualification and with approval. But their own branch, they called social democracy or proletarian democracy. Then the Soviet rulers simply took command of the word democracy and cornered it for their own system, denying it to the Western type, which they called capitalism or bourgeois democracy. Nowadays, they call themselves and their satellites people's democracy, whereas we of the West deny the name of democracy to them altogether. And what is in a way amusing is this, that even as between Stalin and Tito, Stalin will not admit that Tito's regime is a people's democracy.
But Tito calls it a democracy.
But we have had, in the last few years, quite a number of important pronouncements to which not only we, but the Russians have subscribed. For instance, we've had the Atlantic Charter idea, the Four Freedoms. We've had the United Nations Charter, to which the Russians have also affixed their signature. And we've had now the International Bill of Human Rights. They do tend to specify some things that go into the content of democracy.
Yes, it's true, but I think we should make two reservations on that. One is that in some international documents, like the Bulgarian and the Romanian treaties, the word democracy, yet they still mean something very, very different by it.
I noticed, Feiner, the other day when Secretary of State Acheson was talking about the Spanish question. He laid down some of the specifics that would be required before Spain could be admitted to the community of free nations. And he said it was difficult to see how that could happen until Franco liberalizes his government and permits such basic liberties as the right of habeas corpus and trial by jury. It seems to me these are typical things that we Americans insist upon as the content of democracy.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting to notice that in the clarifications of idea from the advent of Hitler onward, 1933 onwards, in all those controversies, some distillation of what is finally meant by democracy in the Western sense came out and is in fact embodied in the directives for the German constitutions in the states of the occupied zone. And I think that we should underline this because this is a crucial difference between East and West in matters of defining democracy. We say to these German governments, if you want a really democratic government, then those who exercise political power are obliged to renew their mandates regularly by references to the people, that popular elections are conducted under competitive conditions in which not less than two effectively competing political parties submit their programs, and 3, that political parties are democratic in the sense of being voluntary associations that do not require the previous registration with the state before they begin to operate.
This excursion into history and this list of the requirements that the Western democracies would put on the term democracy is an indication of the difficulty that we face. We agree that democracy is the form of social and political organization, but when we list these requirements, it's well to bear in mind that Stalin, in his speech on the new Constitution, specifically insisted that a plurality of parties is not necessary. You won't have one in the Soviet Union because there's not a plurality of classes.
Yes, well, he went straight on from the quotation that Mr. Worth gave, straight from saying that he had a democratic system, almost directly to this point, that only one party should exist in the Soviet Union, only one party was necessary, and in fact, we can understand him, he's very proud about that.
It's a problem not only of the difference in the consideration of parties, whether one or many would be essential to democracy, but take another idea, the idea of your attitude toward the expression of opinion. In the West, tolerance means the permission of any person to have any opinion, however dissension, even contrary to democracy. That is looked upon as a weakness and therefore a lack of faith in democracy and possible fascism.
Doesn't that mean that, on the one hand, if you suppress anti-democratic views, you're called a fascist in the democracies? And if you fail to suppress them, these anti-democratic views, you're also called a fascist?
Yes, we look upon the suppression of opinions as being a part of the totalitarian or police state. But it'd be well, I think, to pause here. We've been talking about these differences of ideas, this difference of ideologies. What is the significance of it? Is this just an academic distinction? Are we talking about words? Does it have any bearing on the crisis of the world today? Any practical or political application?
Well, to my mind, I think this has two important applications. In the first place, to understand what is in the background of the other man's mind is most important in the course of diplomatic negotiation. The minimum safeguard that you want is not to be disillusioned when you've made an engagement in the long run. And the second thing is, what is the relationship between the internal form of government of a state and its capacity for peaceful relationships with the rest of the world?
Differently from the way in which Feiner has just looked at it. It seems to me, to a lot of people, it doesn't make very much difference what the intellectuals are talking about. But nevertheless, these ideas are the weapons through which wars are fought and peace is made. Here, I would like to cite one of your distinguished colleagues, John Dewey, another American philosopher. He said, "We need one world of intelligence and understanding if we are to obtain one world in the other forms of human activity. And therefore it does make some difference whether we are on one side or on the other side of these ideas. If these ideas harden on both sides, the differences become pronounced, then conflict is more likely to occur. If the ideas soften and converge, then perhaps understanding takes place." I should like to suggest that probably here in the case of democracy, we're dealing with a kind of instances where when everybody is in fashion, nobody is in fashion. When everybody uses the word democracy, we must look into the content of the word to see the differences. In other words, ideological conflict is now within democracy rather than between democracy on the one hand and some other form of social and political organization on the other.
Well, it might be put in that form. Then we still have to discuss what it is that divides Democrats. Why aren't all Democrats united?
This formulation of the problem is directly in line with what the experts in Paris said 8 days ago when they went over this long list of questionnaires. In other words, in one sense, our problem is clearer. Now, we all are aiming at a democratic idea and a democratic ideal, as opposed to the 20s when there were anti-democrats to oppose us. But that also makes the problem more difficult because now one must differentiate kinds of democracy, ways of achieving the purposes of the people, and the participation of the people.
Doesn't that mean, McKeon, that we not only have to look at the definitions of the word, which of course is important to scholars and is important for public opinion, but we also have to look at the practices which go with it? In other words, I would feel that in America, as elsewhere, we can see whether we mean democracy or not by what we do about labor relations, about housing, about health, about race relations, and about civil rights. These are the tests of whether we mean what we say.
Well, I'd put it even, in a slightly different way, if not more strongly, namely that the ideological conflict is not merely a conflict of words. It's a conflict of the actions we take and the ideals we have as well. There's no way of separating the solution of a material or an economic problem from our ideas, because the way in which you reform the situation of any part of the world, the lot of the people anywhere, or the relations of the people, is by a scheme which you express by ideas. And therefore, the ideological conflict is in part words, it's in part facts, it's in part action.
Yeah, we have to be very careful that we don't mislead ourselves by an incantation, chanting the same word and meaning something very, very different by it.
But it is, I think, true that there is a genuine difference between the Russians and our view of democracy. And perhaps just looking at it superficially, certainly one difference would be that we attach much more significance to personal liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of association, protection under the law and the Constitution. And they attach much more significance to social and economic well-being.
Well, I think the difference goes much deeper than that. The difference, the essential difference is the extent and machinery of participation of the people themselves in deciding what their welfare, their liberty, and the rest shall be. It would seem to me that democracy must mean what the origin of the word makes it mean. It is government by the people. And when you've got the Lincolnian phrase, government by the people, for the people. Of the people we can regard as just a hostage to rhythm. But for the people is provided by the Russians. That is all right, and I agree. But by the people, that seems to me to be the real guarantee of any progress, economically or otherwise, that any people can look forward to.
You have a statement of opposition between the two extremes of doctrine. The emphasis upon social and economic democracy, which the Russians are making, the emphasis upon political democracy, which finally you state so eloquently in the name of the Western democracies. But that is exactly our problem. It's a problem which we have been debating for the whole 19th century, for the whole 20th century. Democracy is the rule of the people in its own interests. But who are the people? How do they rule? What are the devices? How can we make our faith that political rights are a way of securing social and economic equality? How shall we answer the Russians who speak of these vast regions of the world, China, India, as well as Russia, where some measure of security, of economic and social equality is essential before people can enter into the participation in civil rights?
Well, I think they themselves would say, those unfortunate peoples, that until they got their political emancipation, they never were able, in their own definition, to make progress in the way they wanted. And to me, therefore, the political contribution, that is to say, free competitive parties, freedom of association, and an elected and disciplined legislature and executive is primary in all political and economic advance.
But I wonder, Feiner, whether these dependent and somewhat underdeveloped peoples in the world, such as those of China and of India and of the Pacific and of Africa, are going to regard these promises that you are just stating as genuine, as the promises for bread, the promises for security, the promises for social and economic well-being. I think here we have let loose, in the name of this term democracy, a virus in the world. That is perhaps not the proper word for it, but an idea which is capturing people by the millions and the hundreds of millions. And it is now a struggle for the adherence and the loyalty of these peoples. Are they going to go to the Russian way of life or to our way of life? Seems to me that is implicit in this conference that you attended.
I think the emphasis that you put is a good one, because the debate in the world today is not a debate between two sides. It is not one set of ideas against another set of ideas with the two participants deciding. It's a debate in which the entire world is involved. And it is the intermediate regions, it is the underprivileged peoples, it is the people in the devastated countries of Europe and of Asia who are deciding. It is also intermediate in the sense that there are many forms of ideas that come together and mingle. And that is part of the democratic process, the impinging of idea on idea, the testing of ideas.
Yeah, I still, though, however, to make my own position clear, will have to keep my eye on the ball. Namely, that the two protagonists in the world today are these great republics, the People's Democratic Socialist Republic and the Republic of the United States. They are either the fomenters of war or they are the pillars of peace. And so long as they differ so markedly, not on the very ultimate ideal, but on the machinery whereby the ideals of justice, liberty, economic welfare are to be obtained, so long must there be some friction in the world, which, of course, I really do deplore.
But the test of all of this, Feiner, it seems to me, will come if the differences between these two social and economic and political systems can be adjusted through nonviolent means. And if we can accept that value as part of the principles and the operations of democracy, I think we have made some gain. In other words, both internally and externally, it is a question of resorting to the device of counting noses rather than break heads to settle differences of interest and differences of opinion.
Well, that's how I would like it to be. But, you see, even democracy has a police force. Even democracy uses some coercion at home, however kindly it may be, and when the votes are all counted. The votes, in fact, sometimes vote for the exercise of some coercion.
It is well, I think, to emphasize the place that the ideological conflict holds in the present situation. There is a tendency for the power conflict, the political situation, to split the world into two inconsistent parts with different ideologies. The differences of ideologies may soften that conflict. Otherwise, it will add danger to it.
But it would be well for all of us to remember, the Russians as well as ourselves, that this idea of democracy is as yet an unfinished business, and that each generation will add to it new content and new meaning in the light of the problems that people face.
Yes, well, I'm most favorable to all discussions of this kind, to clarification. But I believe there are distinct differences between the disputants, and they mean much to mankind's happiness. I believe that Western democracy is the greatest single advance in mankind's history, and I would want no obscurity or confusion about this.
And clarification there will mean that we will lower suspicion and abolish misunderstanding.
I quite agree, though I must say again that I look with a little reserve on the agreement registered in the UNESCO Declaration.
The ideological conflict that we have been discussing today is one in which we're all involved. It appears even in our own discussion. But it is clear from what we have said that it's not merely a verbal or a terminological dispute. It's a dispute which involves the interpretation of facts, the interpretations of the motives of other people, and it has immense practical applications. The statesmen and the diplomats who enter into debate at present are talking this language using these terms. If we can clarify the terms, the issues will be clearer, and the suspicions and the hatreds will be somewhat relaxed. It is, I think, interesting in particular to emphasize what UNESCO is doing, the difference between the atmosphere in which scholars come together to examine basic ideas which have practical and political importance as opposed to the mere political disputes which lead merely to victory of one side or the other.
Thank you, gentlemen. You have been listening to the University of Chicago Roundtable discuss Democracy, World Hope, with Herman Feiner of the Department of Political Science, Richard P. McKeon, member of the American delegation to UNESCO, and of the Department of Greek and Philosophy, and Louis Wirth, president of the American Council on Race Relations, and of the Department of Sociology, all of the University of Chicago as participants. This week's Roundtable pamphlet includes the full text of today's discussion and the special report published in this pamphlet for the first time in the United States of the UNESCO study of the philosophical analysis of the current ideological conflicts concerning democracy. You will want to receive this pamphlet and to study this important UNESCO report on the use of the term democracy today. Be sure to write for your copy and send 10 cents in coin with your order to the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. For $3, you may subscribe to the pamphlet for a full year and receive 52 weekly issues. I'll repeat the address: the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. Next week, the Roundtable will discuss how much Social Security for your old age. And now, a special announcement.
Would you like to be better informed and better able to answer such questions as, can worldwide ideological conflicts be resolved? What are the alternatives to the Cold War? Can world democracy be built? The University of Chicago Roundtable has prepared a special home study course in world politics to aid you in understanding the political problems of our time. This course gives you a library of reading materials and personal individualized instruction in a program of 14 lessons which you complete in your own home. To learn about this presentation of NBC's University of the Air, write your local station of the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois, and ask for the leaflet explaining Roundtable Home Study on World Politics, telling how you may join this Roundtable Home Study course.
This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.